It was the first night of camp, and a group of tough kids from the streets had hardly unpacked when the leaders received word about a theft that had already taken place. A work crew kid for the camp was missing his wallet, which had $35, and he was also missing his watch. The next morning, Kirk, who was an intern from the city, found the empty wallet in his cabin. He immediately called the group together and hit them with the hard facts. He said, "Man, you guys did exactly what society expected you to do. You just proved them right, and it's a shame. Now you've got 20 minutes to come up with the cash and the watch, or we're all going home." Kirk walked out and shut the door. And after he did, he could hear the guys shouting at one another and scrambling around inside the cabin. And it wasn't long before the door opened up again and the toughest kid in the crowd came out and presented Kirk with $35 and the watch. When the staff person came to collect the goods, someone asked, "Who did it?" And Kirk replied, "We all did it. We're all guilty. We're in this together." And then he shut the door and began to talk to them about God's grace. This morning, we want to talk about God's grace. We've been working our way through the book of Romans. And we're in chapter 3, and we're doing it chapter by chapter or section by section. And so far, in the all of Romans that we've looked at, it feels like Paul has been hitting us hard, telling us we're no good, we're worthless, we're sinners, we've let God down right and left. In fact, in this very section of the book, in chapter 3, verse 23, he says, "For all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory." Or in the translation that Sharon and I use, he says, "For everyone has sinned and we all fall short of God's glorious standard." How do you like to hear that? Nobody likes to be told they're a screw up, they're a mess up, they've made a mistake, they're sinners. Nobody likes to have the fingers pointed at them, but that seems to be what Paul is doing here. It's not a pleasant reality to think that each one of us sins. Each one of us disappoints God regularly. We let God down. We push God away. We hurt people. We judge others. We mess up. Our lives are a mess. We fall short more often than we measure up. Yet, some beautiful things happen in this passage, and I don't know if when Sharon was reading them you caught them, because Paul has this way of kind of talking in big circles and in a way that kind of makes you miss maybe what it is he's trying to communicate. And so I want to spend some time this morning kind of unpacking the beauty of this passage and what Paul is trying to communicate here to us, which is vitally important that we get as followers of Jesus. Paul tells us in chapter 3, verses 19 and 20, that the purpose of the law is to show us our faults. Listen to what he says in 19 and 20. "Obviously, the law applies to those to whom it was given, for its purpose is to keep people from having excuses and to show that the entire world is guilty before God. For no one can ever be made right with God by doing what the law commands. The law simply shows us how sinful we are." Well, if we can't be made right with God by doing what the law commands, then why have the law? What's its purpose? And that's what Paul is saying. It's simply to show us that we're sinful. Well, why do we need to be shown that we're sinful? Because we need to see that we have a need for grace in our lives. And for someone like me, who sees things in black and white, who is a rule abider for the most part, It's hard to hear. Yet maybe it's good to hear because maybe it frees me from some of the black and white and from some of the pushing rules on other people who aren't rule abiders. You see, Paul says we don't measure up. We fall short. We mess up. But that's not where Paul stops. And it's real easy to hear him go on and on and on about how awful we are, how big we are, and miss the but God. And twice in this passage, Paul says, but God. Though in the translation Sharon and I have, once he said, yet God. But it's the same thing, but God. Paul says in verses 21 and 22, but now God has shown us a way to be made right with Him without keeping the requirements of the law, as was promised in the writings of Moses and the prophets long ago. We are made right with God by placing our faith in Jesus Christ. And this is true for everyone who believes, no matter who we are. For everyone has sinned and we all fall short of God's glorious standard. Yet God, or but God, with undeserved kindness, declares that you are righteous. He did it through Christ Jesus when He freed us from the penalty of our sins. For God presented Jesus as the sacrifice for sin. People are made right with God when they believe that Jesus sacrificed His life, shedding His blood. This sacrifice shows that God was being fair when He held back and did not punish those who sinned in times past, for He was looking ahead and including them in what He would do in this present time. God did this to demonstrate His righteousness, for He Himself is fair and just, and He declares sinners to be right in His sight when they believe in Jesus. So what Paul is doing is he's telling us that we all mess up regularly. We all fall short of the standard of God, but it doesn't matter if we believe in Jesus. If we embrace the grace that God extends to us through Jesus, that's the but God. All of us are sinners and fall short of God's glory. But God, with undeserved kindness, declares that we are righteous. He did it through Jesus, through God's grace given to us through Christ. My life and yours are a mess. We let God down. We don't measure up. But God extends His grace to us. But God gives us undeserved kindness. Grace. Grace, brothers and sisters. It's a beautiful thing. And it's even more beautiful when we embrace it in our lives. Grace is not something that we earn. It's unearned favor of God. Grace is not reserved for good people. Grace underscores the goodness of God. We're all a mess. I am. You are. We are. Everyone in the world is, because we're human. Because we disappoint God, because we push God away, because we judge others, because we have trouble relating to other people. We disappoint God regularly. We're sinners. We don't and won't and can't measure up. But God, with undeserved kindness, declares that we are righteous. But God covers us with His grace. Denise writes, I needed more time to study before my final exam in my youth ministry college class. When I got to class, everybody was already there and they were busily cramming those last few minutes before the professor walked in to administer the test. The teacher, Dr. Tom Hufty, came in and said he would review with us before the test. Most of his review came directly from the study guide in the back of the book. But there were some things, Denise says, that he said that she had not heard. And later, after she talked to others in the class, they hadn't heard it either. Somebody raised their hand and said to Dr. Hufty, "We haven't heard any of that stuff before." And he said, "It's in the book." And so they didn't argue. Finally, it was time to take the exam, and Dr. Hufty told them to leave them face down on the desk until everyone had their exam in front of them, and he would tell them when to start. Denise says, when I turned over my exam, to my amazement, all the answers were filled in. My name was written in red at the top of the paper, and on the last page it said this. It said, "This is the end of the exam. All the answers are correct. You will receive an A. The reason you passed the test is because the creator of the test took it for you. The work you did in preparation for the test did not help you get your A. You have just experienced grace." You see, brothers and sisters, like those students in that class, we can't do a thing to earn God's grace. Yet we live in a world that talks about earning and achieving and doing and bases value on the achievements that we acquire in our lives. Yet God doesn't care about any of that. And we can do nothing, absolutely nothing, to earn God's grace. Listen to what Paul says, 19 and 20. He says, "Obviously the law applies to those for whom it was given, for its purpose is to keep people from having excuses and to show that the entire world is guilty before God. For no one can ever be made right with God by doing what the law commands." He's saying in a nutshell, you can't earn it. You can't do enough to earn favor with God. Yet we try. Yet we bargain. Yet we say, "Oh God, if you'll just do this for me, I'll do all this." And then in 27 and 28, Paul says this. He says, "Can we boast then that we have done anything to be accepted by God? No, because our acquittal is not based on obeying the law. It is based on faith. So we are made right with God through faith and not by obeying the law." He's making it clear, brothers and sisters, that we cannot earn our way into God's favor. It's not about being good or keeping the law. We turn it into, "I'll do this," and then God does something for us. But it's not about what we do. It's about what God has done. And God has done grace. He's given us grace. He's extended grace to us. The only thing we can do in response to grace is receive it, is embrace it, is welcome it into our lives, is recognize that we don't deserve it. That's what Paul's saying. We don't deserve God's grace, but it's a gift that God is making available to each of us, everyone, even the worst of the worst. And all you and I can do is embrace it, receive it. And when we embrace it and receive it, it does something in our lives. It doesn't make us want to follow the law. It makes us want to honor God in appreciation and gratefulness for the grace that He's extended into our lives. That's the but God. We can only receive it. The grace that God offers us. And I can't receive it for you, and you can't receive it for me. Each of us has that choice, what we're going to do with the grace that God extends to us through His Son, Jesus. Question is, will you embrace it? Or are you going to keep trying to earn your way? You can't. You can do everything you think you can do perfectly. But it won't be enough. You'll still mess up. You'll still disappoint God. You can't earn your way. All you can do is embrace the grace that He extends to you through His Son, Jesus Christ. It's available to all of us. Paul says that in 21 and 22. He says, "But now God has shown us a way to be made right with Him without keeping the requirements of the law. As was promised in the writings of Moses and the prophets long ago, we are made right with God by placing our faith in Jesus Christ. And this is true for everyone who believes. Everyone. Even the worst of the worst can embrace the grace that God offers them, and it will change their lives." The only thing you and I can do is to embrace the grace that is offered to us. And when you receive it, it changes your life, and you extend it then to others. You let go of the need to judge, to point fingers, to put people down. And you become a person who extends grace because you've experienced grace. And the mark of that says that we've experienced the grace truly in our lives is our ability to extend it to others. Jesus told the parable. We call it the parable of the unmerciful servant. You know, he owed the master a lot of money. And the master said, "You know what? Don't worry about it. It's all forgiven. Go out." And then he went out and he found all these guys who owed him money, and he made them pay. And the master got word of it, and he called him back in, and he said, "What? I let you go. I forgave all this great debt. And you couldn't return the favor? You couldn't extend it?" So he locked him up. And the reality is, if we embrace the grace that God offers us and we can't extend it to others, we really haven't embraced it in our lives. You see, the way we live in response to God's grace is a changed life, is out of gratefulness. It's not an attempt to earn it. When someone does something nice to you, it makes you feel good. And you want to do what? You want to do something nice back to them or to someone else, right? I mean, you've all experienced someone doing something nice to you. It brings good, warm, fuzzy feelings inside, and it makes you want to do something nice either back to them or to someone else. On Friday, I visited my 92-year-old neighbor in the nursing home. I was there for a little more than half an hour. She was very unhappy. I don't blame her. I'd be unhappy too. But she was unhappy because the first time in her life, she finds herself in a situation where everything is out of her control, except the ability to control how she responds or how she treats other people. She went on and on and on for that half an hour about how awful it is and how bad and mean the people are to her. And then when a nurse came in and asked to help her because her light was on and she had pressed the light just prior to my coming in, she was nasty with the nurse. She's reaping what she's sowing. And you would think she would have learned in her 92 years that being kind to others creates kindness in them and a desire to be kind to you. Now, I didn't tell her what I wanted to tell her, because for 19 years I've tried hard not to get on her bad side. But I did ask her. Yeah, when you're on her bad side, you're done. You're on the black list and you never get on the white list. And I did ask her a question, and I hoped she'd think about it. I said, how you're behaving helping you? And she didn't have an answer for me. But I hope that she's thinking about it. And that's the same thing that happens with God's grace in our lives. When we realize that we are all sinners and that we have failed God miserably, that we have disappointed God, but God extends grace and we receive that grace in our lives, then it changes the way we relate to one another. It changes the way we live. We live our lives in gratefulness in response to the grace that God has extended to us. So my question for you this morning is this: how do you respond to the grace that God gives you? Will you receive it? Will you embrace it? Will you allow it to change the way you live? Will you let go of trying to follow the rules and keep the rules and keep the laws and point out the failures of other people and recognize that you fail regularly? But God extends grace. He extends it to you. He extends it to me. He extends it to us. He extends it to the whole world. He extends it to the worst of the worst. Just think for a minute what a different world we live in if the church would get this. Instead of thinking that we're better than everybody else and pointing fingers and pushing down and putting aside people because they're sinners. We name all these things that are sins in the world and in other people's lives, and we don't look in the mirror and recognize that, as Paul's telling us, the truth is we are all sinners. But God has extended undeserved kindness, grace to you and me. If we embrace that grace and live our lives in gratefulness, it changes the way we interact with each other. It changes the way the world perceives us and perceives God. I don't deserve His grace. You don't deserve His grace, but He extends it to you and me. And I'm grateful. And it should affect the way I live and you live because I'm grateful. And when the world sees that, they'll be drawn to God. No one, the world doesn't like the way we project God. Who likes to be made that big? But God extends grace to each of us, to all of us, to everybody. Thanks be to God for the grace He extends to you, to me, to us, to the world. And may we receive that grace and extend it to others. Amen.